In a recent survey that we at Daggerfinn conducted for a client of ours, we found that individuals are shifting in their preferences in terms of what they're looking for as part of their work arrangement, and that's across benefits, across what they're looking for intrinsically, outside of, say, the core job responsibilities. And what we found is that there's been this shift since the start of the pandemic to where people were looking for remote opportunities and leaning their preferences towards that kind of flexibility, and they're leaning it a little bit heavier into compensation right now. And in this article here in the Wall Street Journal that talks about how they surveyed more than 10,000 knowledge workers and found that these individuals are looking actually to lean more towards flexible hours than remote work, speaks to that transition, I think, where because of worker power at the moment, I mean, we're seeing a massive labor shortage, and what that does is it shifts power away from the employers and to the workers who have a little bit more option in terms of where they work and things like that. You're seeing then that as we shift the preferences, companies then have to be very aware of not making decisions that tie them into unintended consequences long term. So our survey talked about how there was a shift just in general towards compensation. This article talks about that shift of knowledge workers towards flexible work over remote work. And what that speaks to is just this disruption and this turmoil in terms of preferences. And what I think that is, of course, it shows how much power workers have. And really, workers in this state where they have this amount of power, this is the only real state where we can start to see these shifting demands. In a world where employers have most of the power and the labor market is a lot tighter, you don't see headlines where workers care more about this or workers care more about that. And so it's definitely a boon time to be a worker and to make those transitions. But our survey, and if you contrast our survey results with this survey, it speaks to the idea that there's no certainty at the moment around what people want. And that of course, is driven by just the uncertainty in the macro environment in terms of the world. We still have the coronavirus variants out there. There's political turmoil at the moment. There's kind of global turmoil as well. There's markets turmoil when it comes to equities. So there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and with that, you're going to start to see this shift where workers, if you survey them, every month of the year, for example, I think you're going to start to see different preferences almost on a monthly basis, to where certain things will matter more and certain things will matter less. And to be prescriptive around that information, if we look at, for example, Peloton as an example of making decisions, say, based on short-term fluctuations, for example, a lot of the issues that Peloton is seeing right now it has to do with the way they've run their business based on a massive uptick in demand, right? And the over-ordered inventory and their supply chain has issues at the moment, and what that results in is this dramatic fall off that we've seen recently, to where as demand has come back to where you could argue it's more of a standard level. The decisions that they made at peak demand are looking like bad decisions. And we'll draw that over to the hiring side and employer brand. It's easy to see surveys all the time and say, okay, workers care more about flexible hours right now. Workers care more about compensation at the moment. And make big decisions for your organization based on these sample data points, or data points that are a snapshot of a moment in time. And my prescription and the prescription that we'll talk about here is that while it's important to understand these data points, you shouldn't make your talent decisions based off of these massive waves of preference. Stick to the fundamentals, because if you make a decision to where, okay, our entire workforce is now going flexible hours, it's hard to pull perks and benefits back at a later date, because then you start to bring in the threat of increased churn and increased turnover and poor retention, because it's a human nature kind of thing, to where if you give somebody something, to take it away again is just a difficult thing to swallow. So I think it's important to understand the dynamics that are happening in the market, the dynamics around preferences, because if you can make incremental changes, smaller changes that reflect, the dynamism in the markets right now, that's always a good idea to do, and build in, small programs and small incentives to match up to these preferences. But big sweeping decisions are difficult, and big sweeping decisions take a lot of effort. They take a lot of resources to implement, and big sweeping decisions based on what is probably the most tumultuous labor market that at least I've seen in recent history is a recipe, I think, for disaster long term. So that's the point of this recording. Of course, our survey talked about this shift from the preferences being everything around work from home to compensation. The Wall Street Journal is reporting among knowledge workers specifically that the workers care more about flexible hours and remote work, and that's because, on average, I think knowledge workers typically have a higher base of pay, and so money probably isn't as much of a factor. And so just to make note that companies shouldn't make big decisions based on these moment in time statistics or preferences, and to really just focus on the fundamentals of being a great employer, making sure that your employees are taken care of, being flexible as an employer to be able to match up to different preferences in moments of time, and not to make big sweeping changes, because as we talked about, the anecdotal evidence or the canonical one right now would be Peloton, and then if you make big decisions, it might not work out in the long run.